Mike from Good Blokes. As I said to you when I kind of rebranded it towards the end of last year, I probably should have done it the other way around and done a few Google searches beforehand, but I'd been using the name The Bloke for the last 10 odd years or a decade and kind of describing what I was up to and what I was doing, and then realized for me, it's like, no, this website's was never meant to be just about me or the bloke. It was always meant to be about blokes, about good blokes. And I kind of came across that name, changed the website URLs, did all of that, and then thought, oh, hang on, let's do a Google search, and realized there was a gentleman just over the ditch who we've just noticed we seem to dress to get the same way, and as the world works. So I thought I'd get in touch both to have a chat and see what you're up to, and also, highlight your work.
Right. Thanks for having me on.
So I guess the first question, which is probably the big one we're all working with, what is a good bloke these days? For years, it's been defined and changed, and it gets pushed one way or the other way. And I think everyone from young boys through to middle-aged men to the older blokes have seen things change. Is there a definition these days, or is it more just something we're figuring out as we go?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a question that I get asked a lot. Having started an organisation called Good Blokes Co, it's often the first question people will ask me, and really I named the business that because I want us to have a look about redefining what we mean when we say a good bloke. And I think in Australia, I imagine it's pretty similar in New Zealand, but I feel like we talk about mateship a lot, but do we really have each other's backs? Do we really know how to look after a mate when he's struggling? And what is being a good bloke? Is it just about being able to have a couple of beers with a bloke, or is it more than that? And I want to help blokes to build those kind of mateships and those kind of friendships where they can have a beer and a game of pool, but they can also have a deeper chat and know how to support a bloke when he's struggling. So for me, it's a bloke who knows how to have fun, a bloke who knows how to laugh, but also a bloke who's actually willing to be there. A bloke who gives a shit is a phrase I use a lot. I think if you want to be a good bloke, you've got to be willing to think about what that really means and be shooting towards the best version of yourself. You're not going to get it right all the time, but I just think we've got to think about what that potentially means and the impact we have on young blokes and other people around us, the impact we have on women as well. As a lot of women in the world saying that they don't feel safe and celebrated and valued. And I think we can play a part in that. I think being a good bloke is all of those things.
Well, yeah, and for me, when I took on the name The Bloke, I was looking for I was looking for a name to describe what I was doing, and to me, the becoming blokey had almost become a slightly negative thing, whereas it had been associated with people drinking a lot of alcohol, playing a lot of rugby. Not that there's necessarily anything wrong with either of those, but it was almost like you became too blokey. It's what I suppose people now almost would describe as the toxic masculinity, or it's a little bit too much. And then you could see it's shifted back the other way, which most of us now understand is there's these things called emotions and feelings and stuff that we also need to be able to integrate, I think, is part of it. But then you have the swing again back the opposite way, where you have guys now who are too blokey and they're now called toxic masculinity. So that pushes back. It's this weird flux where it kind of pushes back and forward. And I think it becomes a bit of a challenge in to find, where that sweet spot is that not expected. I don't think expected, because I think that's the issue, is expectations has created some of these issues. Maybe just where it's healthy. Where is it healthy to be?
I think the key is for us to move away from other people's expectations of us as blokes. Like if you want to play lots of footy and drink lots of beer, great. But if you're only doing that because that's the only way to fit in, that's where it's an issue. And if that's the only type of bloke that we celebrate in our world, that's an issue as well, because blokes who don't fit that mold feel like they're not valued as human beings. So I want us to get to a point where we value footy and we value beer, but we also value dancing and singing and poetry and being a nurse as a bloke, and all of those things that might not necessarily as fit into that traditional mold. Let's value all the diversity of manhood. Let's celebrate blokes who are winning on the footy field and on the cricket pitch as much as we celebrate blokes who are winning in science and the creative arts and all of those things.
Yeah. So you've sort of talked about taking on that name as well. I mean, what was your background? How did you get to decide that you wanted to form this company? And the other part of it is, what do you do? What is Good Blokes?
Yeah, well, I was an acupuncturist for many years, and most people know that acupuncture is good for back pain, but you can basically treat everything with that as an alternative, complementary therapy. And I really got into mental health stuff, and I was treating a lot of people for insomnia and anxiety and depression and all these kind of things. And it was a couple of personal issues. My best mate, I nearly lost him to suicide. And in that moment, I realized that I was having all these conversations with these people at work, but I wasn't having these conversations about well-being and about mental health with my mates. So one of my patients actually said, "Oh, you should come and sit in our men's group." And I'm like, "Oh, men's group, what's that?" So about probably almost 10 years ago now, I got drawn into this world of sitting with groups of men and actually talking about what's real. And it was absolutely fascinating to me, in this idea that we could talk about stuff and the whole spectrum of what's going on in our lives, from being happy and having hopes and dreams to being in despair and to really struggle. So I moved more and more into that space and into the rites of passage field in supporting boys to really think about what adulthood can mean to them. And I just got hooked on the idea of having conversations proactively. So Good Blokes Co. is primarily about starting the conversation around manhood and masculinity. So having places where teenage boys can talk about, what is that shift? What is it about being an adult? And what is it about being a man that's shaped who I am? And what kind of man like I said before, who do I want to be versus what does society expect of me? And then for adult men to talk about, well, how can we be the best blokes we can be and potentially lead in our workplaces and our homes and our communities? How can we create spaces where blokes are okay to ask for help, where blokes are okay to admit that not everything's okay, and blokes know what healthy masculinity is and how to respect women and lift women up without labeling blokes as the bad guys. So yeah, we do retreats, we do father-son camps, I do some parent presentations and corporate presentations around healthy, positive manhood.
It's interesting because I've talked, it gets interspersed in all the podcasts and shows and stuff I've done. But I mean, the real kernel of what I am doing now actually started many years ago, like 3-4 o'clock in the morning. And it was the after party. Basically, it was the after parties. I was DJing. I spent 10 years in the nightclub scene, but I always found myself drifting back to those after parties, because that's when the party had been done and you had a small group of generally guys, but it was sometimes mixed, in a lounge. Someone was playing music. Often I was the guy DJing at that point, because that's where I kind of like to play the music to that group of people. Yeah. And you would have these conversations that, to be fair, many times we'd been aided by certain, what do we call them, social lubricants, to enable those conversations, which interesting, have their own history that ties into exactly what we were doing. It's just went on a different path. But we used to talk about this notion of wasn't quite pre-internet, but it was certainly pre-Zoom meetings or having these chats and everything. And it was just like, wouldn't it be great to have a fly on the wall camera set up where we could just record these conversations that guys and people were having, not necessarily to teach or anything, but really just to showcase and document, so people could see, oh, other people have these conversations. It's okay to have these conversations. And it always struck me, and I've realized over the years, I didn't need those to be out, into wee hours of the morning and to be on various things to have these conversations. but it's sometimes tricky, and it takes, I think, to me, it takes a lot of bravery on both people's side of things to be able to drop straight into those conversations. But over the years, I've learned the quicker I can do that, the more fruitful it is for both parties, because they're great. We want to have them. We don't want to talk about the weather and necessarily about what the national sports team is doing. People are yearning to have conversations.
Absolutely. I think that's the huge thing. Like, and when I talk about, I hear people say, oh, blokes don't want to talk about the real stuff. They don't want to talk about the emotions. I think most blokes are really ready for that conversation, but still our normal workplaces, our sports clubs, our communities aren't places where those conversations feel safe. And a lot of us as men will have had that experience of opening up about something that's a little bit vulnerable, and someone else will take the piss, make light of it, make a joke in some way. So a large part of what I do is helping blokes to gain the skills to have that conversation either with a group or with a mate, because there's social lubricants that aren't alcohol and aren't drugs out there. There's actually ways to make those conversations and to normalize those conversations that I think we need and I think we want. And I think humans have always had. When you think about what life was like, back in the day, we're out in the day doing all the work and getting things done and farming and getting food and building shelters. And then at night we'd gather around the fire and we would have deeper conversations. How are you going? How are your relationships going? How's work going? Are you looking after yourself? As well as, who's going to win the rugby on the weekend? I think those are still important conversations to have. But we need to be able to take their conversations deeper. And I think what most blokes don't realize is actually skills involved in that. So that's what we do in our men's retreat, on our Good Blokes retreats. Like, let's learn the skills to help your mates to open up, which obviously you benefit yourself when you can do that on a regular basis.
Well, yeah, I think that's the thing. It's sometimes, it requires a facilitator to actually guide and to push and nudge people a little bit and go, cool, this is what we're going to be kind of talking about. And it's something I've noticed. I had a conversation with Mike King recently. He's a gentleman here in New Zealand who's campaigning pretty hard for mental health, particularly for kids. But it was also it was a conversation from some guys in the US, actually, an organization called Walk the Talk America. And these were a group of therapists and counselors. And, they actually talked a lot about their qualifications and everything. But they were interviewing a gentleman who didn't have the qualifications, but was facilitating these conversations and talking about these things. And it tied it back to something that Mike had said, that the problem, not the challenge we've got at the moment, is because we've lost that sort of guys talking to each other. When somebody has a trouble, they tend to sometimes dive straight into therapy, dive straight into that the medical side of things, which can sometimes be the ambulance at the bottom of the hill. Whereas I think we've lost, for a lot of us, is the ability to have these conversations with other guys and blokes and friends and everything. So we don't even need to go that far. We don't need to jump straight to a therapist. But that's not to say that there isn't still some structure and, like you're doing, somebody to facilitate it. It just doesn't have to become a medical thing, or it doesn't have to be, it can be a lot lighter in certain ways.
Yeah, 100%. I think we certainly, if everything's not okay, then you need a therapist. It's very black and white, this view that we have in our world. Excuse me. I think it's worth noticing that there's 100 steps in between I'm fine and I'm in crisis mode. There's a lot of things in between that could do with a conversation, like, oh, I'm struggling a bit at work. Like, there's a conversation that doesn't need a therapist. I'm not sure if I'm getting out of work what I wanted to get out of it, or whether it's the right career direction. You don't need a therapist for that. I'm having some troubles with my son. I don't know how to talk to him about X, Y, and Z. You don't need a therapist for that either. There's a million conversations in there that I think we're missing out on as blokes, because we think, talking about anything deep and meaningful is only for people who are really struggling, and it's only for psychotherapists. I think, whether you're a facilitator or a leader, I think we need spaces where we can facilitate more of these conversations. And I think that actually prevents a lot of us from getting to that crisis point.
Yeah. Which then the other point is, it means we're not overloading that system, which really in some ways should be dealing on those people who are at that crisis point. And as I'm just trying to think the words Mike he sort of said, we're giving Formula One mechanics basic servicing work or stuff that shouldn't be the issue.
Yep.
You know, and there's no doubt, I'm sure, same Australia, the health systems, mental health system, everything will be overloaded. So
the waiting list to see psychologists in my town of Perth is ridiculous at the moment.
Yeah. And it's two things then. One, hopefully it's a case of we can kind of talk and not necessarily always provide. You don't always have to provide the answers. I've realized that, but sometimes just being able to have these conversations with each other.
I think it's actually important on that note not to provide the answers, to be actually standing beside someone and go and just really listening. It's one of the big things that we talk about. Helping him define his own solutions, I think, is more powerful than me saying you need to do this, you need to do that. Just listening from a place of empathy and encouraging them to get, to find their own solutions, to get support if they need it. For some blokes, they might need to see a psychologist, and it might be a mate who said, "Yep, mate, you really need to get to see a psych because I'm worried about you." That might be the support that they need. Whereas it might be just helping them to brainstorm their own solutions to something that might not need that level of support.
Well, it's something I realized in the last couple of years. I've been on and off again, and it'll be on again soon, is actually seeing a counsellor, because there's, we'll call it years of neglect. And it's sort of, right, okay, we need to actually start dealing with this. Yeah. And I even said to the counsellor I was talking to, it's like, I've realized yes, I have friends and people I could talk to about it, but in this case, I need someone who has a bit of an understanding of the structure and the working of actually how to essentially tease it out of me, would be the way of looking at it. But at the flip side, I'm realizing they're just a mirror. They're just mirroring everything back in some ways, and it is me just working through, but they just know how to keep that going when it actually starts going. And I think that for a person running a retreat or or anyone, that's a good part of it. We often have the answers ourselves. We just need to be allowed maybe to come to them, I suppose.
100%. And that's really the skill in facilitation of the sort of retreats that I run. So I run men's retreats, and I also teach facilitation skills sometimes to teachers or to people in other kind of groups that want to run these sort of camps. And a lot of it is, particularly for us as men, it's putting down this need to be in charge and to need to be the boss and to need to have the answers. When we drop that need that I have to fix this person, which is, I think, as men, how we're kind of programmed, have the answers, be in charge, take charge, be the boss. Well, in this case, I'm just sitting next to you and I'm just listening, and I'm just helping you to sort of draw it out. So it's a different set of skills. Facilitation skills in that space are hugely important skills, whether you're facilitating a process like that or whether you're just a leader of a group of men, I think, to promote those deeper conversations.
Well, when I saw you were facilitating men's groups, it was something quite familiar to me. So growing up, my parents were, the term born again hippies is not quite correct. There was that alternative lifestyle. There was a resurgence of an alternative lifestyle coming through in New Zealand a few years ago. My parents are very much involved with it. My mother is a massage therapist, but then also pulsing, and then the other sister, all the way through to some people who are doing crystal healing and all sorts of stuff. But sweat lodges were certainly something that was also there as well. Yeah. And it was something I reflected on a while ago. Is we used to belong, and the wording's quite interesting. My mother and father used to belong to something called the Boys Club. And the Boys Club was basically a group of guys and their partners and kids and everything, going out and doing tramping or restaurants or everything like that. But ultimately, I think it was a lot of drinking and partying, right? And then that kind of disbanded. And years later, I remember Dad, and I don't know if he formed it or was involved with it, but quite regularly there was a group of men that would come over as a men's group. And there was no alcohol, and there was no obviously other things. And they were sitting around basically talking. And I was too young, I suppose, to be involved or to see it. But my father had already known that he'd been involved with a group of people like that. And although mum was a nurse and a healer by any definition, Dad did it his own way. He was a lot more stoic, and that was the men sitting around talking. So, yeah, it's something that's always been sitting in the background for what I've done. Is like, well, yeah, there's that gap. And unfortunately, the sitting from say the hunters, I'm involved with the firearms industry and the hunters, that idea of sitting around the campfire and stuff now is there's conversations to be had that potentially go a little bit deeper than maybe they are at the moment. So.
Yeah, and I think what you're hinting to there is a lot, like I said before, we've always had these kind of conversations, and we're clutching at different ways to make them happen. You know, for a lot of people, I think alcohol is something they use because they want to get into that state of intimacy. And is it normal for me to have a conversation with my mate? Oh, well, it's normal for me to say, let's go to the pub and have a beer. So we'll do that. So I think if we're trying to find a healthier form of it, it's like, well, what are we using instead of alcohol? Maybe we're going fishing. Maybe we're having a hit of tennis. Maybe we're going to kick the footy around. It's like you've got to find something that's that common thread, that catalyst for bringing people together. And then if you set a bit of an intention, oh, we're actually here for a proper chat. On my men's retreats, there's no phones. We go to places, no reception anyway.
Yeah.
But I say to blokes,
beautiful places, those.
Yeah.
They're rare, but they're beautiful places these days.
Don't bring your phone, don't bring your laptop, don't bring your work, and don't bring any booze. And if blokes show up to explore these topics without alcohol on their phone, 80% of the work is done. You know, just in coming there with the same intention and without those distractions.
I think at the same time, and it's something I'm exploring, funnily enough, with fishing, is almost having some backdrop or some activity for blokes to be doing while they have those conversations. And it might be the conversation that fits in between throwing bait over. Or I noticed, look on your site, and there's a lot of almost what I'd call bushcraft sort of territory, but it's out in the bush. But so it gives you some framing and some context for that to be within, rather than two guys just standing at each other opposite chairs, or, you know, and just, it's right, we're going to nut this out. It's like, all right, we're in an environment, we've kind of set a bit of a tone and everything, but now let's have those conversations and let them just flourish as well.
Yeah, well, two things. In bringing another activity in, like, you know, carving a wooden spoon or whatever it is, you're usually sitting beside each other rather than sitting down one-on-one saying, let's have a serious conversation. Or we do a bit of bushwalking. We go for a long walk and chat with the person next to you. It's much less confronting than sit down in front of him and tell him your deepest, darkest secrets. So it does that. It sort of takes a bit of the pressure off, and just dropping a, you know, conversation prompt, let's talk about work, or let's talk about relationships or whatever. And so the hiking or the fishing or the crafting or whatever it is provides a bit of a, you know, it helps us to drop the guard. But also on a second level, we actually need fun and friendship. Neuroscientists talk now about 3 different levels of connection that we need. We need the common sense of purpose. We need a deeper sense of emotional support, but we also need fun and friendship. You actually need people in your life that you can have a laugh with, tell some jokes. Like I said, you know, have a bit of tennis, go for a jog together, go fishing, whatever it might be. That's actually an important part of it. So I used to think around those activities were just a way into the deeper conversations. I now realize they're an absolutely crucial part of it. It's almost impossible to have those deeper conversations without having something else to sort of knit us together with.
Well, it's something I've watched a little bit of what you're doing, and you mentioned earlier is rites of passage, and it's another thing that seems to have disappeared, at least. And I talk from my perspective, which is Kiwi European based. You know, there's indigenous cultures that still have these and are still using them. Although, even as we get more urbanized, they seem to lose it as well. But as I was actually doing some research. Do you? And this might sound slightly ignorant, but in Australia, do you guys do the yardie at a 21st, or is that actually a Kiwiism?
It can be a thing in Australia and certain parts of the world. It can be, you know, and so the whole thing for me is that it's not actually that rites of passage has disappeared. We just create our own versions. And when you look at the rites of passage framework and how historically it's been done throughout history across cultures, it's a community experience. There's the presence of mentors. There's a real intentionality. There's a community marking this boy as a young man. There's deeper conversations. There's reflection. There's some clarity for him. You know, this is your role in our community now. This is what we need from you. This is what being a man is. And there's challenge. So in the Western world, we've taken that challenge aspect and gone, oh, that's a rite of passage. The challenge aspect is only one piece of it. Whether that was hunting a lion or surviving by yourself in the bush for a week, it's an important part, because we need to know as an adult that we are capable of looking after ourselves and contributing to a society. But we've dropped all the other parts out, the sense of meaning and purpose and community and mentorship and intention. So we have a big thing around leavers or schoolies we have over here. I'm sure you have something similar to that. When you finish year 12, you go out and drink as many beers as you can and sleep with as many people as you can. And is that actually supporting young people to become adults? I don't think it really helps, nor drinking a yard glass of beer on your 21st or any of those things. So it's not that rites of passage don't exist. It's that we're just not really aware and conscious and switched on in terms of what we're doing. And we're not, as a community, gathering around young men and saying, hey, this is what we think being a healthy young man is. What's your version? How can we support you to be the best person you want to be? We're kind of leaving young blokes in the dark and then wondering why they're falling off the edge of a cliff and why they're driving their car into a tree and why they're assaulting a young woman when we haven't actually given them the skills around negotiating a healthy, happy life.
Yeah, it's something I reflect on because, I mean, for my 21st, I didn't do the yardie. There was no way I was going to. At that point, it just didn't assign, my journey into manhood did not include drinking 1.5 liters of flat Coke without beer without throwing up. It didn't mesh with me, but at the flip side, I was also at that time in my life, it was just, I was basically starting to deal with some childhood trauma and everything. So what I reflect back on is what you've said. There was also no structure, there was no handing over of the mantle going, right now, not to say that, oh, you're a man now, so you've got to do this and responsibilities, but there was no surrounding with the men in my life going, welcome to that next step. And I think for a lot, even people doing a 21st yardie, that's still not going to help them. So there's almost this feeling of, I'm still a kid. Where was this change into manhood and what did that actually mean? And now I've got kids of my own and I still feel like I'm still trying to figure out how I'm not ready for adulting. what's going on here?
It's a common experience. And when I work with boys in high schools at times and we talk about, they're in year 10, they're 16 years old, and you're in the body of a young man, and you're at that stage in your life making choices that will affect you for the rest of your life, potentially your mates and other people around you. You're making choices. At the end of year 11, you go to a party, you have 3 beers, you go upstairs with someone. You're making choices in that moment that can affect you and that other person for the rest of your life. But do you have at that point a clear expectation and a clear idea of what you think being a good man is? And I don't think we're surrounding boys with conversations around manhood and around mental health and around resilience and around respect for women and all of that kind of stuff. So as a consequence, I ask most men, when did you first feel like a man? And often they'll say, oh, when I had kids, or when I became the boss of work, or when we bought a house, or these big moments. And I'm like, how old were you? And they're somewhere between 25 and 45. And it's like, well, when were you in a man's body? And when did you start making decisions that had that kind of massive impact? And they're like, oh, 15. So we're leaving blokes with this gap of 10, 20, 30 years of not actually knowing what's expected of us. We're not marking, you are a man now. Let's hear who you want to be. And we are going to support you and hold you to account to your own idea of what manhood is.
Well, what I think is even more borderline terrifying is what fills that gap then. If it's not there, then what do guys turn to? They're going to the social media that we know of, porn replacing sex education. It's just like, okay, so that's apparently what is expected, and that is how an interaction actually is. It's like, no, but it'll happily fill the void. So what people think the norms are has just become this. Well, it's not really, but it does become their norm. I mean, this is the thing. It's normal is just what is normal. Again, doesn't mean it's healthy. It just means it's normal to you.
Yeah, and learning about sex via porn, I don't think is a great education. In the same way that learning about manhood from a combination of your mates and YouTube is probably not a great place to learn about that. And think about all those tiny little messages they're getting on a constant basis from movies, from hip hop music videos, from gaming, which tends to be ultra masculine, ultra violent, and those messages from society. Look at the evolution of Batman. Look at 1950s Batman to 1990s Batman to it just gets hyper masculine, you know? And so they get these messages saying, oh, you're supposed to be soft and tender and delicate and vulnerable and respectful. And on the other hand, you're supposed to be a tough guy and have all the muscles and don't cry and don't be a pussy and don't be weak and don't back down. And I think these messages are really confusing. And I think boys need to understand, and men need to understand, yes, we need to be courageous and vulnerable and open and honest, and we need to be resilient and accountable and strong. And it's not like being vulnerable makes us soft and weak, or being authentic makes us soft and weak. We actually need to be more resilient and more accountable and more reliable, I think, as men. We need more yang and more yin. It's not like one takes away from the other.
Well, I sometimes wonder, and the words become tricky with this, but there's almost a confusion, I think, in some ways between the males and females and masculine and feminine. Because feminine is not necessarily meaning you're a female. It is just certain attributes. And again, there may be better words for this, but it's like, no, you say the yin and the yang. I did many years of Tai Chi. So you become very aware that both need to occur for you to be a whole. Otherwise, if in their case, if you've got more yang than yang or more yin than yang, you're going to end up sick one way or the other. It's out of balance. But yeah, it's that. Again, I guess it's that people trip over the terminology, but it's the feminine, which may describe emotional things and anything, things like that, doesn't make you any less of a man just because you are able to express those parts of it. And vice versa, for women who like to go hunt or be quite sporting or anything, it doesn't make them less of a woman. There's just different aspects, and it's all important, again, to be able to, I think, integrate them is probably the key to it.
Yeah, and look, from my history as an acupuncturist, we always think like yin and yang oppose each other. We know that fire can boil water and water puts out the fire. But what we don't often talk about in our Western culture is they actually rely on each other. You can't have day without night. You can't go and do heaps of work unless you had a good 7 hours of sleep. So we actually need both of those things. We need to go out and do the work, or we're sitting on the couch all day eating potato chips. And we also need to rest and look after ourselves sometimes, or you die without sleep. And so some of us in this men's work kind of field are all about strengthening our masculinity and resilience and all of that. And that's important, but you actually need both to have a healthy, happy life. And there's almost this strength and resilience idea. It's like, you know, this idea that emotions are a bad thing. Well, guess what? We're human beings, and emotions are driving us in every minute. And the more you actually build an awareness of that, the more resilient you can be. So it's not like emotional intelligence turns us into softies. Emotional intelligence actually makes us stronger, more resilient, more able to stay in line with our values and who we want to be.
And I think it's good now because we have, and everyone has their loves and hates, but we're seeing men who are what you would consider basically big, strong, outdoors kind of guys who are still able to express emotion and cry and show that, you know, there is, it can be both, or it could be, you don't have to be a huge guy to have it at the same time, you know. So it's good seeing that we've got, we'll call them role models coming out. But I guess the flip side then is back to that notion. There's so much online of potential role models or information or anything like that. It becomes kind of overwhelming. I mean, even for me, I'm trying to, it's great. I think of any question in the world and I can Google it and try and find some answers. But I can also find 3 or 4 conflicting answers that will give you scientifically proven, completely opposite answers. Or how much salt should you have? I did it today. How much salt should I be getting? Oh, you need to reduce your salt. No, you need to increase your salt intake. And it's both are backed by science, both by doctors. So it becomes, I can see, and that's me just figuring out my salt intake. How to be a man is, I don't know if I'd want to
even
type
more
that into Google. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the big thing is for me is, look, if you Google, you know, what is a real man, you'll get a million different answers on that. And I think really the key thing is to think, well, who do you want to be? One of the big things we do in our programs is, well, what do you want your life to look like? What are you trying to create for yourself and the people around you? And what kind of man do you want to be? And that, I think, is the most important thing. And I think we can get a bit confused and a bit lost because we're not having these conversations and we don't have people guiding us towards healthy manhood. But I think you can get really lost down, you know, in traps on YouTube and all these other different places where you can find all these theories on what men essentially are. And I think it's really important at times to put that shit down and think, well, who do I want to be? What's important to me? What are my values? What I'm passionate about? Who do I want to be? And then use that as your GPS and as your compass for making your life decisions, rather than anyone else's expectations of what a man should be.
Which is sometimes what's also interesting is that requires space. So you're back to this notion of going out without a phone, without that external stimulus. And for some people, it's the guru on the mountain of just going, sitting and sitting on the mountain and giving yourself some space, which is, I think, and for myself included sometimes, is it's slightly frightening because you're never quite sure what you're going to find there when you actually, you know, give yourself that space to actually think and reflect. And, you know, it's that worry of, well, what might I find looking back at me when I peer down into the abyss?
Yeah, and I think that, well, number one, it's hard for us to find time, to find 3 days off to go and sit without your phone. And, you know, often at the start of the retreat, it's like, who regularly has 3 days without your phone? And no one puts their hand up. But I think that fear as well, it's around, it comes from that socialization we have as men to not have any problems, not show any weakness, not have any vulnerability. And there's a fear like, well, if I open it up, what if I'm afraid of stuff? What if I'm sad about things? What if I'm angry about things? And, you know, spoiler alert, you are.
You're right, yeah.
You get sad about things, you get afraid of things, you get angry about things. And actually, the more you build awareness and get better at sitting with those emotions, the more you know who you are, who you want to be, what kind of man you want to be in all those different situations. So I think it's absolutely crucial to, and our programs are really mindful. We go for a walk in the bush and like, think about what's hard, think about what's great, think about where you want to be. And it takes all of the pressure off and just be okay with what comes up. I think the time and space is absolutely crucial.
So what types of men do you, or what groups of men do you have coming in? I mean, is it, I would assume by the time you go, right, I want to go to one of these groups or something like that, you're already kind of on the path. You're looking for something, I would imagine. But have you found...
Yeah, it varies quite a bit. So you know, we go for 18 plus. We've had 18-year-olds on our retreat, and the oldest blokes we've had was 76. So we get a real range there. We get a cultural range of blokes who've grown up in WA, in Western Australia, and blokes from all over, from, you know, Singapore, and a bloke from New Jersey on the most recent retreat. So cultural backgrounds, diversity. But in terms of what kind of bloke, you know, I talk about it a lot as a Good Blokes retreat is a leadership retreat. It's a place to learn those skills so we can guide future generations. So we do attract a lot of dads, you know, particularly blokes who've recently become a dad, and people that want to make a change, you know, at the hockey club or in the workplace or whatever. And we also get blokes who are really struggling. So there's often a spectrum from blokes who really need help and are lonely and isolated towards blokes who are really willing to have an impact on their world. But the thing is, those blokes that are ready to lead kind of have to unpack this stuff within ourselves. I think if we're going to lead a healthy culture of manhood and masculinity, we've got to think about how this has shaped us ourselves. For me, as a leader in this space, you know, being a real man has made me a real workaholic, and that drive to be the provider still really affects my ability to relax and to wind down. So how can I create spaces for blokes to unpack that to themselves unless I'm really ready to sort of unpack that for myself? So I think us as leaders, we have to look into the dark of our own selves, which, as you said, can be scary. But also as blokes who are struggling, we need to consider ourselves as leaders, because if you're really struggling, well, what impact are you having on your partner? What impact are you having on your kids? You're probably not having the impact you want, whether that's a struggle with sadness and depression or anger issues and violence. You know, this is a chance for you to lead, and every impact, every sort of interaction you have with another person is potentially leadership. So yeah, we attract blokes that are really anywhere on the spectrum from I'm struggling, I'm in crisis, towards I'm doing really well and I want to give back. So yeah, it's a really fascinating diversity that we get on the retreats. It's really interesting.
Well, I think the thing is that there's I get tired, I guess, of listening to people who have been financially successful in all these different things, and then have this flip and then start telling people how they need to be living their lives and be more mindful and everything. And you're like, well, yeah, but you're out the other end of it. I've always found it more interesting of people where I can relate more to people who are on the path of that journey, rather than have sort of done it the other way, made all their money, done everything, and now can turn around and go, okay, well, now I can meditate for 8 hours a day. And that's what you need to be doing as well for it. And I can do it 8 hours a day because I've got a private chef and all these different bits and pieces. I find the stories of the gentlemen who are on that path or starting on that path to be way more interesting, way more fruitful to me, because I can relate. It's probably the biggest thing. I can actually relate to them.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing for all of us as men to explore sort of how it's affecting me. And for me as a leader, I'm constantly sharing my stories of what I struggle with now, whether it's my relationship with my kids or a relationship with my wife, or, like I said, my difficulty in still being a workaholic. I think we hear a lot of people, even in the mental health now space, we hear people talk about, oh, I used to have anxiety and now I've got no. We don't that often hear people say, I'm actually having a rubbish day. How often on social media do you hear people saying, I had a rubbish day, I couldn't get out of bed this morning, I tried to do some work for my computer, I went back to bed again? And we're just not hearing those stories. And I think the more we hear people open up and share our stories, the more other people can come with us. And I think that's where honesty, vulnerability is probably the most powerful form of leadership in this space. And that's what, like you said, that's what engages people, and that's what brings people in.
Well, it's like I say, it's a lot more relatable. I mean, I've had a thing recently, I've become aware of. So I have a lot to do with firearms licensing and stuff in New Zealand as well. And we have, I think, as a bit of an issue is if you want to see a bloke who's nervous about talking about his issues or anything like that, well, one, take a bloke, two, take a guy who's now got a firearms license, potentially has a perception of losing all of that the moment he goes to talk to a counselor or anything or ask for help like that. So, it just compounds, and it's been important for me to kind of, which is part of the shift for me into Good Blokes, and what I'm doing now is going, right, I'm on that process. I have a firearms license. I'm going through counseling. I have issues like everybody else on it, but that we just get on and do it. And this is how I'm doing it. And hopefully other guys see it and go, oh, okay, well, it's not as that fear that I have of what might happen. Well, if I can document it and show it to others, then it makes it easier for other people to do and to do themselves. So
yeah, absolutely. And that fear around, if I admit to any problems, I'm going to get fired from my job and, like you said, lose my license or whatever it might be. But I think the reality of the situation is you can be emotional and still get on with the job. And we know that because most of us have been doing it for years. I had to put my dog down 2 years ago. I tell this story a lot. And I was really emotional. She was 15, but I had to be the one who had to make the call and say, let's pull the pin on her life. And I was sad because I was going to miss her, but also mostly because I had to be the one who made that decision. That weight really weighed on me. And I was like, what if I denied her another month or so of life? And I can remember the next day mowing the lawn and just my face flooding with tears. And what was interesting about that for me is that it didn't stop me from mowing the lawn. It didn't stop me from doing a good job of mowing the lawn. It didn't make me even take longer to mow the lawn. I was just crying at the same time. And sometimes when you're struggling, you need to take a day off. But a lot of other times you can just be having a rubbish day and get on with it. Like you can actually go to work and say, how are you going, Jeff? Yeah, I'm actually really struggling, but I still think I can get that project done by 3. Or, I'm really struggling. I might need an extra hour or so to get that project done. Or, I think we can be honest about that kind of stuff, because this whole idea that we can leave our personal lives at home, it's absolute rubbish. Like that emotional stuff is fueling us and driving us a lot of the time. Let's just be a bit more honest about it so we can support each other better.
Well, I think the danger is if you don't do that and allow it to come forward, which is something I'm learning of those emotions come forward, is not trying to instantly clamp down and repress on them. At some time, they just build and build and build. And I've had times in my life where you just get to the point where you are non-functional because there's just so much that is built up that your brain, in my case, response mechanism is basically switch off, for lack of a better term, and I'm just not capable of doing anything. And it hasn't happened for many years now because of process of working this through. But I remember as a kid, it was the same thing. As then the girlfriend split with me, well, then for about a day I was pretty much almost in fetal position.
Yeah.
But that's because I didn't know how to actually express or just let it out. Whereas the reality is, probably if I'd actually had a good cry and been lost in everything for a while, like you say, then we can carry on moving on. But if there's this blockage there at some point, systems will just stop. It's been something I have noticed. I've said this to a few people, and I've talked to a few people, and I know I'm not the only person. But ever since becoming a father, I now find myself, the things that trigger you emotionally have changed. And the thing that I find, it's great, I don't mind. At the same time, I find it kind of hilarious, is some kids programs, you see this little message about fatherhood. And my little girls occasionally turn around. She's like, "Daddy, why are you crying?" I'm like, it's pretty hard for me to explain why that robot man and that completely random thing has just triggered me. But it's something to do with childhood or an interaction between a parent and a child. And I'm just learning now. It's like, one, it's okay for my kids to see me cry. I don't necessarily have to explain it. I'm just like, look, it's just something as a father now, I find that triggers. It's awesome. It's all good. It's all good, kids. And then within 30 seconds it's gone and we're on to something else. But sometimes it's just like, where did that one come from? Because it, like I say, there's a giant stomping robot or something, which is the archetypical, father saving a little child thing. And he's like, it just overwhelms. But it's a vent. It's almost like a pressure relief valve, I think, that just lets me vent and carry on as well. So
and if we don't release that pressure valve now and again, it's just not healthy. And we know that's really not healthy to be suppressing emotions all the time. So look, there's a few things in what you've just said. I think it's hugely crucial for us to be modeling that towards future generations. Like, we can cry and that's okay. And like you said, it comes and it goes, and it doesn't ruin your day. It's more likely to ruin your day if you're pretending that it's not there. And I think as well, I've had those emotional moments watching kids' movies and all that kind of stuff. That we really, I think as men, when we become fathers, well, look, I'll just speak from my own experience. Becoming a father really made me think about what is manhood, and how my father was with me. How much of that do I want to pass on? Like, my dad gave me some incredible traits and was an incredible dad in many ways, but he was also, a post-traumatic stress disorder Vietnam veteran who wasn't great at managing his anger, and I didn't want to pass those on. And I saw myself, naturally reacting in certain ways, and it took a lot of work for me to get better at managing my emotions, as well as displaying those emotions for my kids. So it can be such a huge moment, those key sort of parenting moments and those vulnerable moments with the kids where you're feeling that emotion. And look, I just encourage men to lean into the challenge of being emotional in front of your kids. I think it's useful for them to know that it's actually okay. It's okay to get sad. It's okay to get cried. It's okay to be angry. It's not okay to be violent with another person.
Yeah.
But it's okay to be angry. It's okay to be afraid. It's not okay to stop doing everything because you're afraid of it.
Yeah.
It's okay to be sad. It's not okay to stay at home for a month from school just because your girlfriend broke up with you, So let's manage those emotions better and know how to express them and start to build a vocabulary. Sometimes as young blokes, we're taught to not have any emotions and not have any feelings. Well, how are we supposed to build a vocabulary for even knowing how to express it if we're pretending they're not there,
I had a great one recently. My 5-year-old had been one of those, probably lack of sleep, all things, they all fit. And it was just a day where I was having a few issues in fatherhood. And she turned around to me, bless her, and she basically tapped me on the arm and said, "You're doing okay, Dad. You're doing okay."
I love it.
I was like, thank you. That's all I need. And then we're off again. So it's like you say, becoming a father is one of those things where you're like, all right, now we're going to figure this out on top of still figuring out all these other questions as well. So yeah.
And those acts of kindness are just beautiful moments to celebrate. And I don't think that means that, we worry sometimes that our kids will have to look after us. And I think they still know that you've got their back and they know that you're the dependable one. I don't think, showing the vaguest bit of emotion makes us appear any less stable for our kids. I think if we start to practice actually being aware of our emotions, I think our kids actually see us as more stable and more supportive for them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, they know you're human then as well.
Exactly.
You know, they're a lot smarter. I think the great thing is with kids is they just often don't have those social constructs or filters or expectations already formed. They're forming very quickly. I can see they're forming very quickly, but you have those moments where you're like, yeah, actually that's the way I should be reacting to something, but I've got now 40 something years of filters and stuff on top of it that's shaping how I think I should be reacting to it. And there's moments of it, it's like, oh, actually that's what you're doing right now, not having tantrums on the floor because I can't have ice cream, but there's certain things where you're like, yeah, actually that I can learn from you. That's been the big thing as well. And particularly for me, having two little girls, because I had a brother, we were two boys, so it's a different world for me as well, seeing that. So which has been awesome. So
yeah, and I think we need to be really mindful of those, you know, those constructs that we're passing on to our kids, that girls should be a certain way or that boys should be a certain way, and that, you know, am I as soft and vulnerable and tender with my nephews as I am with my nieces. And because all of those little tiny interactions teach boys that, you know, that this is how I'm supposed to be in the world. And when we, you know, when you meet a couple and we hug the mum and we shake hands with the dad, is that showing the son like, oh, cuddling and softness and intimacy is okay for women, but not okay for men, you know? Yeah. I don't know. I think we have to make a conscious decision about how we want to be with all these tiny little interactions, because every interaction is modeling for kids. Are like sponges, you know, they just suck that stuff up. All of the bits that we're not even thinking about.
Good, bad, otherwise it doesn't matter. You can't be selective. Exactly. But I remember dad used to be, you know, our family physical contact was good. I'd hug my father and everything. But I remember dad saying he didn't hug his father to granddad was something like 80 something years old.
Yeah. Wow.
And, you know, he was World War II, ex-soldier, certain, you know, very loving, no question about it. But there was physical contact was been a thing. And it's been interesting for me as a flip side, because even in work environments where I go to tap somebody on the shoulder, bloke, female, whatever it is, that I always, at least in the back of my head, have to go, okay, well, not everyone may necessarily be as comfortable with me just tapping them on the shoulder with it.
Yeah. So
there's a management thing of it as well. Although I find most people a tap on the shoulder is normally so it's been interesting. Now post-COVID, we're probably all scared of germs and people contacting each other, so we're going to have another almost generation of dealing with that, which is quite interesting. Because
how do you even greet people? Is it the elbow thing or the handshake or whatever? One of the things that comes up for me there is the thing I talk about with blokes is what I call the intimacy gap. So your dad, who grew up without hugs from his father for 70 years or 50 years or whatever of his life. I'll let you work out the maths. Like he's missing out on something there, you know, he's missing out on that closeness. So I think it's important that we know that you can't expect someone who spent, you know, say you've just become a dad and you spent 30 years without people hugging you, with people shaking your hands and not giving you a hug. And then we're like, here's this baby, be soft and tender and delicate and intimate. I think it's important to realize that that's hard for a lot of blokes. And for a lot of blokes, they'll go, oh, you look after the baby, I'll go to work because I know the rules there and I'm competent and you know, I do a good job, and people say, good on you, Steve, you've done a good job. Whereas I come home and I'm supposed to be soft and tender and delicate. And that's a really foreign space for a lot of men. And even when you think about young blokes growing into relationships, like, you know, they don't see, you know, girls in schoolyards tend to be hugging and soft and doing each other's hair, and boys in the world where I am aren't doing that kind of stuff. So when they get into those close contact
they're busy playing bull rush and spear tackling each other at lunchtime.
Exactly.
Trying not to break each other collarbones.
Yeah, are they practiced in negotiating intimate spaces? So when we talk around consent, I'm actually not surprised that there's women saying, I've been assaulted by a man, because we're not teaching young men how to actually soft and tender and delicate in those spaces. And we're teaching them you're supposed to have all the answers and you're supposed to know what to do. So as a 17-year-old, you have a couple of beers and you go upstairs with a person. Are we helping those boys to be able to say, oh, are you into this? I'd like to do this. Is that what you're into? They think that a lot of them think that's a sign of weakness. And that's actually not what we want from anymore. We want them to know that person that you're with is on the same page, and that takes skills. in intimacy.
Well, we're also with that example as well. We're back to where has their education on that stuff come from, and it's come from a world where consent is it's a strange concept basically online. It's not, you don't see that conversation before the intercourse or the sex. It's just sex, and it's kind of skipped that whole thing. So yeah, it's another very interesting part of it all, you know.
I think we need to, as parents and as leaders of young men, we need to make our voices louder than the voices of the culture that they're living in. We need to, even more so, we need to help them to find their own voice.
Yeah.
So that when they're battered with all these images from Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok and Facebook and YouTube and Reddit and all these other sites, like, we need to help young blokes and blokes of all ages, men of my age and your age, to be, you know, really strong in my own inner voice. So I'm not dragged off track by who other people want me to be and how other people want me to be. And if someone else wants me to have 6 beers and drive home, well, I can decide what's important to me, and I'm not going to do that, you know. Whereas if I'm weak in my own idea of what kind of man I want to be, well, I might go along with someone else's idea of what being a tough guy is and drive home with 6 beers under my belt and kill some random pedestrian. That's not the life I want to create for myself, you know?
Yeah. And I guess that's been interesting for me now as a father with 2 girls. So I'm now also going, all right, they're going to be exposed to young men, blokes and everything like that. And one, it's educating my girls to have a sense of self-confidence and what they need as well. But then also, yeah, what can I do for the flip side of the guys they may be dealing with is a horrible way, but interacting with, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's, I don't know. I think it's an ongoing learning process, which I enjoy. That's the other side of it. So
yeah. And it's tricky. I think there's a lot we can do when we talk about that respect for women and violence against women. I think there's a real appetite out there now for that not to be just a women's problem. And I think us as men, we've got a chance to see those little interactions and those things in men's spaces when we're in a group of men and someone's making sexist jokes, misogynistic jokes about mistreatment of wisdom. You know, we've got a choice in that moment. We can laugh along, or we can say nothing, or we can say that's not funny, or we can even go further and pull that bloke aside and have a chat about it. But whatever you want to do, it's a choice. And I think the world is saying, you know, we want men to stand up in that area and help men to lead in the treatment of women.
Is a bit of a tangent as well. It's something that comes up again. Like you say, there's conversations. It's like, you know, the thing comes up with, or used to, doesn't as much, but occasionally does, smacking kids or you know, hitting kids or stuff like that. And you will have the old fellas, young fellas. I mean, this is, I guess, the other thing. It's not always old fellas. It's sometimes middle-aged or young guys, because where have they learned? It's not just we can't dismiss it and go, oh, that's the old generation. That's just what they do. But someone will talk about, you know, well, I was hit, or I was smacked or disciplined or whatever it was, and I turned out okay. And that's always why I flip around and say, well, yeah, except you're now trying to justify hitting children. So you're all good, apart from you somehow think it's okay and acceptable to hit kids, but you turned out all right, except the violence towards kids things. So, but yeah, that is a challenge, especially if you're in your social circle and the majority of people you don't think they are going to be necessarily turn. And there's that weird point where you say something and then someone else says something to reinforce your suggestion, and then suddenly the tides can turn very quickly. And I guess it's, for a lot of things, I think we just need to get to the point where there's enough of us saying, no, that's not okay. So the new social norm becomes, no, we don't do that. No, we don't behave that way. And even to have a deeper conversation with it, like your mate who's like, oh, I smacked my kids, and I go, it's like, well, how was that for you? How did you find that, to actually unpack that a little deeper? Because from what I've read, the science suggests that it doesn't actually have huge benefits, and it can have significant, it doesn't always have significantly traumatic experiences, but it can leave some kids feeling like that's not a safe place. And if you want to create that stronger relationship, is that something that's going to help you to bring in, you know? So I think it's worth those of us that did have those sort of things, you know, those aggressive parenting styles perpetrated on us. Like, what was that like for you? And is there another way? And look, I'll be the first to admit that parenting is really, really hard. And you know, I don't think
don't think most people make those kind of choices because they're trying to make their kids feel better. That can be the responses, and sometimes they're actually just not the most effective parenting strategies.
Well, sometimes they don't know what is the vocabulary. What else can I do? What other ways can I deal with that as well? And they're going to revert to what their childhood was, or what they feel is maybe that's what needs to be done. So
and sometimes I can remember a parenting expert talking to me about protective use of force. And sometimes if your kid's going to run out into the road, you will have to physically restrain them. And there's times where you do have to get physical with kids. So it's sometimes not as clear as saying, smacking bad, cuddling good. It's a lot more complex than that. And I think really for me, the answer is in hearing each other's stories. How was that for you? Like, what was going on for you when you chose to whack your kid on the bum? And did you even choose it? Was it just an automatic reaction? And what else could you choose differently next time? I don't think we're anywhere without really finding that place of empathy and understanding what's actually going on for us in that moment.
Well, I know for myself, with the points where I've gotten so wound up that I feel like I'm nearly ready to hit one of my kids. At that point, for me, it's now I'm at that stage where at least there's that microsecond where I go, hang on a minute, Kerry, you're about to lose control. You need to step back from this point, because you're about to go into a semi-automatic mode where you've just run out of, and normally I take a step back and then go, what I really need to do is go and have a nap, because I'm tired, because I haven't had the amount of sleep I need, or I had a bad night's sleep, or something completely unrelated to the kid has got me wound up, and they were just enough to try and tip me. But that's not going to make anything better, because if I'd actually did that, I would feel terrible about it for a long time afterwards, and compound it to where I was anyway.
So there's a skill in finding that moment and practicing that pause and taking a breath. That's a real skill that I think we need to nurture as men, going back to that whole idea that we're supposed to have the answers, we're supposed to fix things. Like, sometimes actually taking a pause makes us better at that. And then the other thing is acknowledging that actually parenting in the modern world is hard. It's a relatively recent phenomenon that two working parents are supposed to look after your kids by yourselves with very little support from uncles and aunties and all. It's just not what, it's plain and simply, it's not what we're built for. We're attempting to parent in a really abnormal circumstance. So the more we can build in that sense of community where we can, co-parent and share the parenting load with the neighbors and the uncles and aunties and all those kind of people, it's just goes back again to that lack of community. It's a bit like that rite of passage thing. When we step into fatherhood, are we surrounded by a community then? Are there mentors and older men in our life saying, this is what was hard for me about parenting, and this is how I've tried to stay on track? And I don't think we're supporting men to step into fatherhood in really healthy ways as well, because we lack that sense of community.
Well, I think that's it. And talking again to this Mike King down here in New Zealand, like I said, his focus was on the kids, but I was very aware that for us to focus on the kids, we need to sort ourselves out as blokes beforehand as well. It's not as easy as just going, it's all about the kids. It is about the kids because they're the next generation on, but to facilitate that and to help them along as much as we can, we really do need to sort our own stuff out first, so that we can then just model that to the next generation as well.
Yeah, 100%. We've got to have the courage to actually look inside and say, what has shaped me as a man, what was that parenting situation like for me, and how I was treated by my mum and my dad, and because it's not just men that are aggressive. Sometimes it's our mum that yelled at us or whatever. It's like, which bits of that do I want to carry with me, and which bits are not working for me, and which bits, what kind of father do I want to be? So look, for me, the big question is for the men we need to be thinking about is, who do I want to be? What kind of man do I want to be? What kind of father do I want to be? What kind of human being do I want to be? What kind of co-worker, brother, mate? Like, when we can really answer that question, then, and find a way of reminding ourselves of that, I think life just starts to get easier.
Yeah. So for you over there in Australia, you're doing the retreats and courses. You said you also do a course for the course leaders, or train up the people who want to develop their own.
Yeah, so I do I do father-son camps and mother-son camps and the Good Blokes retreat, as well as some works in schools and corporate spaces. And I also have a training which is called How to Run a Men's Gathering. So that's for anyone who wants to run a father-son camp or a blokes weekend or a healthier version of a bucks party or whatever that might be. I've got one coming up here in Perth in WA soon. And if I get the demand, I'll run one online as well. So if there's people out there who are interested in that, regardless of gender, hit me up and I'll put you on the list. And if I get a bunch of people who are into it, we'll try and run through those steps of how to create that safety, how to design a program, and how to get blokes and young blokes deeper into those conversations.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly that was that course that got me. I was like, oh, that is something I would like to head along to and get along to. Modern times with border restrictions and everything, suddenly the online side of things goes, okay, well, that will potentially happen in a shorter period than actually getting over there. So much like a lot of the guys I know over stateside for the courses and stuff they do there, it's like for a few years now, it's been like, I'll get over there. Australia is a lot closer than the US, to be fair, but at the same time, it seems like at the moment, seems like the other side of the world for many things. So
that's for sure.
So for people wanting to find out more stuff, what's the best bet? Your website and socials?
Yeah, so the website is www.goodblokes.co, and they can find me on Instagram at goodblokesco. And if you search Good Blokes Co on Facebook, it'll come up there as well. And look, this is my favorite thing to talk about. So if people have got questions about what I do or want to have a chat about it, yeah, absolutely reach out. I love talking about men choosing to lead and create more spaces for young blokes and for their mates and whoever that might be. So yeah, hit me up and we'll have a chat.
Yep. And certainly, I mean, for people who are on goodblokes.nz, it's like I have put a link up to your site on there as well, because I kind of realized it's a different methodology, different areas along that path, but heading towards a similar sort of thing, I think. So
I think we desperately need that. We need blokes doing podcasts. We need blokes doing camping trip. We need blokes teaching bush survival skills. We need blokes gathering over, fishing. We need men writing books. We need, all of the different versions of it. We just need blokes to get talking more and connecting on a deeper level and really building those social networks and knowing how to support each other and guiding each other towards better versions of healthy manhood. And my version of it is only one version of it. And so if people can take, a tiny thing that they've heard here and take it off into their, into whatever else it is they're doing, then I think that's a really positive thing.
Cool. Well, thank you for taking the time. I know you just got back from one of your retreats. I need to go unpack all the fishing gear and try and wash the salt water off that and deal with that as well. So, Mike, thank you again very much for your time, mate. It's been appreciated.
Absolute pleasure, Kerry. Thanks for having me. Love the chat.
Cheers.